To continue then with our questions about Mill on higher and lower pleasures, turn now to the second one, the question, what test determines whether a pleasure is higher or lower? Here Mill is fairly explicit in a paragraph I've already read to you, but let me do so again, and then I'll give you some commentary on it. In the paragraph that goes from 31 over to 32, he writes, if I am asked what I mean by difference of quality in pleasures, or what makes one pleasure more valuable than another, merely as a pleasure except its being greater in amount, there is but one possible answer. Of two pleasures, if there be one to which all or almost all who have experience of both give a decided preference, irrespective of any feeling of moral obligation to prefer it, that is the more desirable pleasure. If one of the two is, by those who are competently acquainted with both, placed so far above the other that they prefer it, even though knowing it to be attended with a greater amount of discontent, and would not resign it for any quantity of the other pleasure which their nature is capable of, we are justified in ascribing to the preferred enjoyment a superiority in quality so far outweighing quantity as to render it, in comparison, of small account. There, Mill, in effect, specifies a test with three key elements. You've got to have a panel, and all or almost all the members must agree. That's the first element. Second element, to be qualified to be on the panel, you've got to be, as he says, competently acquainted with both pleasures. You've got to have genuinely experienced both. Third, the verdict on which all or almost all members of the panel must agree for one pleasure to turn out to be higher, the other lower, is that the higher pleasure is so much more valuable than the lower one that any amount of the higher one, however small, is worth more than any amount of the lower one, however great. That's a bit quick, so let me do it again. Yeah? So, three elements to the test. A, you've got to have a panel, and they must all or almost all agree. Two, qualification to be on the panel. To be on the panel, you've got to have, as he says, competently acquainted. You've got to be competently acquainted with both pleasures. You've got to genuinely experience both. Third, the verdict on which all or almost all members of the panel have got to agree for one pleasure to be a higher pleasure and the other a lower is that any amount of the higher one, however small, is worth more than any amount of the lower one, however great. Okay, so that's the test. Yes?
So yesterday when we were talking about the utilitarian, you gave us a little graph or whatever, over A1 and A2. So
Yeah.
in this sense, would you prefer A1 over A2, or would you still prefer A2?
You're in a good area here. This is actually, I mean, what you're pushing is a version of the fourth question. So I want to defer it for a little bit, but you're pushing something that's very sensible to push. That is, you're asking explicitly, okay, so if we make this distinction that Mill makes, how are we going to do the utilitarian sums now? How are we going to add pleasures and pains up to decide which situation is better? And that's an excellent question to ask, right? But I want to come to it in just a tick, if we may, because I say that's what I mean by the fourth question. Yes?
Is there any way that you can kind of maybe put this in a scenario? I guess the three stages of the test.
Put it in a scenario. Well, I don't know. I mean, I suppose to decide whether poetry is a higher pleasure than pushpin, what you got to do is you got to assemble 12 worthy people who have played some pushpin and read some poetry. And, you know, for it to be true that poetry is a higher pleasure, it's got to be true that they would all or almost all agree that any quantity of the pleasure of poetry, however small, was more valuable than any quantity of the pleasure of pushpin, however great. Does that help? Is that the kind of thing you have in mind? So turn now then to the third question. The question, is the test biased, or actually probably somewhat better, more carefully put, is Mill's employment of the test biased? Here's the concern, right? The concern is Mill wants a particular verdict, so he's committed to stacking the jury to guarantee that he gets that verdict. I mean, in particular, right, he wants it to be true that, you know, poetry is a higher pleasure and pushpin's a lower pleasure, yeah? For instance. There's a paragraph somewhat later in the discussion that it's certainly easy to use to suggest that Mill is committed in just this way to stacking the jury. Right? This paragraph is the one that begins just above the middle of 33. Mill there writes, "It may be objected that many who are capable of the higher pleasures, occasionally, under the influence of temptation, postpone them to the lower. But this is quite compatible with a full appreciation of the intrinsic superiority of the higher. Men often, from infirmity of character, make their election for, that's choose, the nearer good, though they know it to be the less valuable. And this no less when the choice is between two bodily pleasures than when it is between bodily and mental. They pursue sensual indulgences to the injury of health, though perfectly aware that health is the greater good. It may be further objected that many who begin with youthful enthusiasm for everything noble, as they advance in years, sink into indolence and selfishness. But I do not believe that those who undergo this very common change voluntarily choose the lower description of pleasures in preference to the higher. I believe that before they devote themselves exclusively to the one, they have already become incapable of the other. Capacity for the nobler feelings is in most natures a very tender plant, easily killed, not only by hostile influences, but by mere want of sustenance. And in the majority of young persons it speedily dies away, if the occupations to which their position in life has devoted them, and the society into which it has thrown them, are not favourable to keeping that higher capacity in exercise. Men lose their high aspirations as they lose their intellectual tastes, because they have not time or opportunity for indulging them. And they addict themselves to inferior pleasures, not because they deliberately prefer them, because they are either the only ones to which they have access, or the only ones which they are any longer capable of enjoying. It may be questioned whether anyone who's remained equally susceptible to both classes of pleasures ever knowingly and calmly preferred the lower, though many in all ages have broken down in an ineffectual attempt to combine both. So you see the worry there, right? Suggested especially by sentences like the one where he says, I do not believe that those who undergo this very common change voluntarily choose the lower description of pleasures in preference to the higher. Men addict themselves to inferior pleasures not because they deliberately prefer them, but because they are either the only ones to which they have access or the only ones that they're any longer capable of enjoying. So you see how that suggests that, you know, if you sort of find an initial candidate to be on the panel who claims to prefer pushpin to poetry, or anyway not to prefer poetry to pushpin, the suggestion in this paragraph is Mill would say, okay, so that shows that this is someone who's lost their capacity to enjoy poetry, so they should be kicked off the panel. Right? And I mean, you can see how that looks like jury stacking by just imagining someone doing it on the other side, right? I mean, you know, you could equally well imagine the fan of Pushpin saying, well, the fact that you think that poetry is so much better than Pushpin just shows you've lost your capacity to appreciate Pushpin. So, you know, there's a real concern. As I say, it's best put, not, I think, exactly as a concern for the test itself, which is okay. It's rather a concern for sort of Mill's employment of it, right? So it's easy to get the impression, particularly from the paragraph I just read you, that Mill is committed to employing the test in a way that seems biased. That is, he's committed to stacking the jury to get the results he wants, to throwing off the panel people who disagree with him. All right. Turn now to the fourth question. Then, right? Question: how do you do utilitarian calculation? Yeah, but don't do that yet. Though. Thank you. Question: how do you do utilitarian calculations if you distinguish higher from lower pleasures? Right. There's a PowerPoint slide I wish I'd done here, but I didn't. So I'm going to have to just describe this one to you. All right. But I mean, it's exactly the issue, the issue about calculation that you raised a little bit earlier. Yeah. So you're a utilitarian, right? So you're committed to being able to decide which of two states of affairs is better based on the amount of happiness or unhappiness. So suppose it's like this, right? Suppose you've got two choices, right? And they both have, as you might say, positive results. They both, the consequences are just pleasures, right? But they differ as to the amounts of higher and lower pleasure involved. So suppose if you choose the first option, what you'll produce is 2 higher pleasures and no lower pleasures. Suppose, by contrast, if you choose the second option, you'll produce 1 higher pleasure and 5 lower pleasures. Then the question is, according to Mill, which is the right choice? Which of these is better? And why? Right? So what do you think? If those are the two options, option 1, 2 higher pleasures, no lower pleasures. Option 2, 1 higher pleasure, 5 lower pleasures. Which, according to Mill, should you choose and why? The first option, you say. Yes, I think that's right. Right. And why? What's the principle on which you're making the choice? What's the measurement procedure? Yeah.
I think it's because he says that higher pleasures are more valuable than lower pleasures, basically.
He does, and he seems to say that in a particular way, right? He seems to say any amount of the higher pleasure, however small, is worth more than any amount of the lower, however great. You understand? Okay. Good. Yeah. So look. I think the right way to interpret Mill here is that you do the calculations like this. If you've got 2 options, first look at the higher pleasures. If one has more higher pleasure, you choose it. You don't even bother to look at the lower pleasure. Right? If there's a tie in terms of higher pleasures, then you look at the lower pleasure and go with the option that has more lower pleasure. Now, there is an alternative way of understanding Mill here. I think it's less good for reasons I'm about to tell you, but here's the alternative, right? The alternative would be to say, no, what Mill means is higher pleasures are worth more than lower pleasures, but, you know, they still both get counted. So it's as though there's a kind of rate of exchange. So 1 higher pleasure is worth 5 lower pleasures or 10 lower pleasures or whatever it is, right? That alternative interpretation, I think, is less good for 2 reasons. One is it fits less well with most of what Mill says in that crucial test paragraph. In particular, the stuff about, you know, would not resign the higher pleasure for any quantity of the lower pleasure their nature is capable of. That passage fits much better with the idea that what you do is first look at the higher pleasures and only if there's a tie do you even bother looking at the lower pleasure. The other issue is, if you had this sort of alternative, call it rate of exchange interpretation of what Mill meant, right? If it was like, you know, one higher pleasure was worth 5 lower pleasures, or 10, or whatever it was, right? Then it would really not be at all clear that Mill had done what he set out to do, which is do anything different than Bentham did. Because if you look at what Bentham says about pleasure, Bentham thinks pleasures differ in a number of dimensions, including intensity. And if there was just this rate of exchange, so that one higher pleasure is worth 5 or 10 or whatever it is, lower pleasures, that really looks just like a difference in intensity, which is something that's sort of in Bentham's story anyway. So if we read Mill in this second way, on this sort of rate of exchange proposal, then he'd have, you know, made this whole song and dance about how he was doing something different and wouldn't have done anything different at all, really. Right? So then, I think the right answer to our fourth question, how do you do the utilitarian calculations, is the other answer. It's the answer, what you do the calculations this way. First look at the higher pleasure. Whatever has more higher pleasure is more valuable automatically. You don't even in that case need to bother looking at the lower pleasure. You only look at the lower pleasure stuff if there's a tie with higher pleasure. Okay? And that does give you a way, right, of doing the calculations. Yes?
When he's saying the higher pleasures but when he says higher pleasure, does that mean that is he saying that the higher pleasures will bring you more overall happiness over the lower pleasures, no matter how many amount of...
Oh. You say, is he saying the higher pleasures will bring you more overall happiness? Well, look, it is, but I think that's, when you look at it, that's a funny question, right? Because look, I mean, that question suggests that there's sort of a scale of happiness that's something over and above what's involved in measuring the higher pleasures and measuring the lower pleasures, right? But I think the natural thing to say is no. There is no. You know, I mean, it's not as if there's, you know, this further question whether, you know, the higher pleasures bring you more happiness than something else, right? To say it's a higher pleasure is already to say that, you know, it brings you more happiness than any lower pleasure does. It's not to leave, you know, it's not to say something else about it and then leave open this further issue about whether it in fact brings you more happiness. Right. All right, turn then finally to our fifth question. The question about whether there are higher and lower pains as well as higher and lower pleasures. In my view, it is in thinking about this question that you see most clearly reasons to reject Mill's amendment to utilitarianism and to stick with the original standard Benthamite view. So, Mill does not himself very explicitly consider how to extend what he says to the case of pain. But surely you have to, right? I mean, you've got to have something to say. Because look, I mean, as any utilitarian, including Mill himself in sort of other moods and other places, will recognize, important moral choices almost always involve pain as well as pleasure. They almost always involve bad stuff as well as good stuff and balancing them, right? So if you're going to use this amended version of utilitarianism, you've got to be able to take the pain stuff into account as well as the pleasure, right? So then you ask, okay, so can you make the same distinction for pain as Mill suggests you make for pleasure? Can you think of what ought by his account to be higher pains and what ought by his account to be lower pain? seems to me they're I mean, the obvious initial answer is yes, right? Look, I mean, you can think of pains that are much more like pains of pure sensation. The ones that I tend to use as examples, this probably reflects my, my own unfortunate early dental history, because I grew up in England, right? So, I mean, and you know the stories about that, and some of them are true. Right? Think about experiences like, having your teeth drilled for some considerable time with no anesthetic. Seems like a lower pain, right? What about higher pain? Well, that would be the obvious candidates for that are things like, disappointment or grief or something like that, right? So it seems like, I mean, at least you've got experiences which have the kinds of characteristics that Mill thinks of higher pleasures having and thinks of lower pleasures having. You can extend in that way to the case of pain. So then you've got to ask, okay, so if you do kind of extend Mill's discussion to the case of pain in a way that he doesn't explicitly, but is modeled on, suggested by what he says, what principles about the relative value of higher and lower pains, relative badness of higher and lower pains, relative value of pains against pleasures do you seem committed to? I suggest, here are two. Go to a PowerPoint for that. Right. I mean, again, this is not something Mill himself explicitly says, but it seems to me modeled on what he says about pleasures. Here's what he ought to think. Let me again be clear about this. This is this is not something. This is not something Mill explicitly says, right? I mean, Mill does not extend the distinction to pain, so he does not explicitly commit himself to any principle. But both of these, particularly the first, seem natural extensions of his view, right? I mean, given what he says about goodness and goodness of higher and lower pleasures, I think P1 is the obvious thing to attribute to him with respect to the badness of higher and lower pains, right? Somewhat more of an extension to get the sort of mixed principle P2 about balancing higher pleasures against lower pains, but again, it seems to me the natural thing to get out of his view. But then I want to argue, both of these are crazy principles, right? To make that argument, you've got to be clear that you're focusing just on the badness of the experience, right? So in particular, when you're thinking about higher pains like grief or disappointment, what you've got to do is bracket, as they say, the fact that you are grieved or disappointed about, right? It's not about how bad that fact is. It's just about the badness of the experience. That's the comparison here, right? You understand? So it's not about, you're not to take into account the thing that you're disappointed about. Put that aside. The comparison here is just a comparison between experiences, between the experience of disappointment and the experience of having your teeth drilled, right? Understood properly in that way, Locke, it seems to me just a non-starter to think that any amount, however great, of the experience of having your teeth drilled without anesthetic is less bad than any amount, however small, of the experience of disappointment. No way, right? Similarly, pick your favorite higher pleasure. Eating your favorite, well, no, let's not do that. Reading your favorite poem, listening to your favorite piece of music, whatever it is, right? Ask yourself, would you choose the package that includes 24 hours of having your teeth drilled without anesthetic plus 10 minutes of your favorite higher pleasure over neither, right? Surely not, right? So that second principle, according to which any amount of higher pleasure, however small, compensates for any amount of lower pain, however great, seems equally crazy. Right? And it seems to me, this is the best reason to reject Mill's proposed amendment to utilitarianism, right? You've got to be able to say something about pain. And it is actually, if you think, it's pretty weird to think that you've got this, if you think of, the natural way to think of pain and pleasure, you've got sort of pleasure on top, and then you've got the neutral zero, and you've got pain at the bottom. So it would actually be pretty weird to think that you've got this, funny scale with this one stuff being, qualitatively greater than the other on the top bit and nothing like it on the bottom. That'd be very odd, right? I suppose you could try that or something, but it doesn't seem like the way it should go, right? It seems like if you're really committed to this qualitative distinction stuff, it should go both sides of the zero, right? But then you try putting it on both sides of the zero, and you try, extending what Mill says in just the natural way, modeled on what he says about pleasure. It seems like you just get these crazy results, right? And it seems to me, as I say, that's the best, the most powerful reason for saying the whole idea is really misconceived, right? Mill himself, as we've seen, knows and tells us about a pretty good response to the objection that any utilitarian can give, right? And that pretty good response doesn't involve any of this wacky stuff, right? he introduces this new and, as he thinks, better response, but it does get us into all this wacky stuff, right? So when I say really be better, not doing it at all, right? You'd really be better just to stick to defending your standard Benthamite utilitarianism with no quantity-quality distinction, no distinction between higher and lower pleasures of the kind that Mill wishes to introduce. Any questions or thoughts about this at all? Okay, so we're done with that topic, and let me just say again one more time, just to be real clear about this. This is a different topic. This is Mill Chapter 2, and it's really a different topic from the next thing we're going to turn to, which is Mill Chapter 4, the proof of utilitarianism. Quite distinct, quite different discussions, different parts of the book, different issues. Okay, and you know, our next session will be on that.